It is reported that the Pentagon has called directly the British government to say how concerned it is about all of this. Of course, it suits the Ministry of Defence to say that the Pentagon has voiced its concerns directly with the government and perhaps with the Prime Minister. The Pentagon, the American government, is not going to interfere in the internal politics of an allied country. It never does, and it won't. But of course, at an informal level, military planners on the American side are bound to be thinking about what defence cuts in the United Kingdom might mean. So, although yes, there is American concern about the possibility of expenditure cuts in the United Kingdom, we should put this in context that this is all part of the smoke and mirrors in advance of the announcement of cuts, where everybody wants to flex their muscles. They're bringing out as many arguments as they can. And one of the arguments, is that it will upset the Americans if we cut into certain programs that will decrease our ability to link to them in the event of a military intervention or a crisis somewhere. I think it's inevitable that the United States military will be watching very carefully to see what the Security and Defence Review comes up with. They always worry, of course, that if the United Kingdom starts to cut its expenditure, not only will that affect Britain's ability to link in with the United States, but perhaps more importantly, they worry that the rest of the European defence militaries actually look at what Britain is doing. So, in other words, our European partners look at the British, and if the British start to cut, they say, well, maybe we should cut as well. And so the Americans see the British as a bit of a bellwether of European thinking. We're a leader in European defence terms. So their concern is twofold. It's how we relate to them, but also how we relate to our other European partners and what sort of signal we are sending about transatlantic relations in general. Behind this story, which does involve a lot of politicking and a lot of leaking, but behind this story is a reality, which is that the United States finds it more and more difficult to include the United Kingdom in its military plans. We are, from a technical point of view, we are just about holding on to the American military. We can just about link in, but we were finding it difficult in the Kosovo crisis of 1999 to link into their air system with what we had. And in Afghanistan, we equally find it relatively difficult to interact with the United States because our equipment is getting more different. And the numbers that we can deploy are now so different to the numbers that the Americans can deploy that it's not clear that they take us militarily as seriously as we think they do. And if our numbers go down, and if our technological edge, as it were, tails off over the next few years, then they will not regard us necessarily as a key partner in military terms. They'll regard us as a useful ally whose support they like to have, but not as somebody who can plug in and be part of a joint military operation, which is the way they have seen us more or less since 1941. Although this is a newspaper story, and you can see why it gets into the news, I don't think this is going to be, as a story, a major influence on the British defence policy as it emerges. The fact is, our relationship with America is always part of the mix. Defence planners are always thinking, what is it we are preparing for? How much are we going to do on our own? How much with our European partners? How much only with the Americans? And so that's in their minds in any case. The fact that it may have hit the news, the Pentagon planners are worried, they will take as just a bit of background noise to the politicking that goes on around the whole defence review. Behind all of the background noise of the politics of this, behind all the newspaper leaks and the things that are in the headlines, there is a reality, which is that the British military are on the verge of being cut quite a lot, and at the moment they're about 1/10 the size of the United States. They spend about 1/10, they get about 1/10 in terms of output. If the cuts were such that they only got, as it were, a 15th of what the Americans put in, or a 20th of what the Americans put in and get out, then we may have crossed a threshold whereby we cannot be a particularly militarily useful partner to the United States. And certainly there are a number of officials in Whitehall and some wise old heads who recently retired who have said, fairly clearly, both in private and in public, that we are on the verge of a step change in our relationship with the United States, and that it may be that this military card that we can normally play with the US, where we are a useful, genuine military partner, that it may well be that after these cuts we simply won't be in that position, and we have to take that into account. If we can't afford it, so be it, but ministers shouldn't pretend that life will be the same afterwards as it is now. If we make the cuts, then we go on to a different level, certainly as far as the United States is concerned. At the moment, it's fairly clear that Britain can't afford to maintain the level that the United States would like us to maintain. We can't afford the present commitments. We have a 36 billion hole in the existing budget, so that if everything was delivered on time in the next 10 years, all the stuff that we'd ordered was delivered properly, we'd be 36 billion out of pocket that we simply can't fund. So we have to make some cuts immediately. The problem is whether we want to make those cuts in the long term. In the long term, do we want to maintain our defence expenditure at about 2.3, 2.5% of our GDP? If we do, then we can still have a significant military that the United States would want to work with and would take seriously. But if that figure falls below 2%, if we come down to something nearer the European average of 1.6 or 1.7% of GDP, then it's very difficult from that amount of money, the amount of money that gives you, to actually have a credible military in the ways in which the United States will understand a credible military. So I think we are on the verge of quite a big change. And although in the long term we might still have the capacity to be a significant military power, the problem is getting over the short term. It's the next 5 years which are the problem, not 10 and 20 years' time, but the next 5.